Hello, and welcome to another edition of Welcome to the Jungle. And Tim Daniel, you joined me saying "ugh" already. Hey, why couldn't these Bengals have the decency to just lay down and die at after halftime? I've got a little story about that. I mean, it would have been a lot easier on our hearts and our expectations and things like that.
Yeah, it's really, really frustrating. I turned the game off at halftime thinking that, you did the thing where you're like, whatever, just go do something else. And then you're like, I'll check back in, see what happens. And I checked back in right on the 4th and goal touchdown, the chase to start the comeback. And I was like, all right, let's see what happens here. And then you start seeing him come back. You're like, oh, this is a football game. In the back of my head going, this is the Bengals. Something's going to go wrong. And hey, wouldn't you know, it did.
It did. It certainly did. And you've admitted to what you did. I'll admit to what I did. My son and I have been. He's 14 years old, just turned 14. We've been watching some TV series. We watched the entire show Psych. We watched every episode of Psych. I started showing him Chuck. I'm trying to not allow it to go too far as violence and language and things like that, but yet still have a good time. And he says, "Dad, you know what we could do at halftime?" He's like, "You could let me stay up still," which that was in the discussion too.
Oh yeah.
As they're down 24-6 and then 27-6 in the beginning of the third quarter, he says we could watch an episode of Chuck while having the game on our iPads, and then if the game gets good, we can go back to the game. And I said, all right, but if we get done with that episode of Chuck and it's not within 7 points, which I didn't think there would be any way, if it's not within 7 points, you're going up to bed. And he reluctantly agreed. And literally when we turned off the Chuck, that's when they scored the touchdown to cut it to 7. And it's like, I guess he's staying up, right?
Yeah, you made the deal.
Right. But okay, retrace our steps a little bit. Awful first half.
Terrible.
The defense showed every reason why we have no trust in it, including the defensive backs not even knowing seemingly what coverage they're in. The offensive line without Orlando Brown, it's almost like I want to make excuses to myself and think if he only could have come back 1 week early, like yesterday, maybe they hold on and have a chance to win that game. They're down 27-6, as we mentioned, just after halftime, and it just looked awful. Your thoughts? You've already said you turned it off for a little bit. What are your thoughts on, especially what were you thinking at halftime?
Probably the same thing we all were thinking. What happened in the span of since January 2023? What happened? I mean, they've literally were mere seconds away from playing in their second straight Super Bowl, and now we're looking at potential pick. We're 2 games out of the first pick in the draft. They're not going to catch that because there's a lot of teams between them and that spot, Jacksonville. But that's where we are. And at that time, I'm thinking like, I can't believe this has happened. How does this where do things go from here? This is an embarrassment. And then again, I went, I'm not surprised. This is what I grew up with.
Yeah. And if it stays that way, as I mentioned, maybe we just all go to bed and we don't really, we still care so much, but at the same time, we might not be where we are now. And the fact is, if the defense had played even 3/4 of the game, the way they did for just around a quarter and a half, and a third, fourth quarter, only giving up the 3 points to that point and keeping the offense in the game. If Burrow had been able to make some of the plays in the first half that he was able to, even he was still under pressure. He was just a Houdini out there. Mm-hmm. Watching him escape Joey Bosa's grasp was awesome. Was very good. It was awesome, but he did it to more than one guy. Just amazing. But he shook off pass rusher after pass rusher, yet he still took hit after hit. He's taken too many. They come back and tie it 27-27. And it was a fumble by the opposition this time.
Yeah.
That allowed them to say, hey, we're going to take control of this thing. And they seemingly did until, again, the wheels kind of fell off.
Yeah, shout out Logan Wilson's knee.
There you go. Or thigh or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially once T. Higgins gets hurt on the almost fumble, you're like, oh, no, this can't be good. And then he ends up having an incredible game. But yeah, I mean, when you make that play there, you're thinking like, is this happening? Like, are the breaks going our way? Are we back in 2022? Like, this is great. And that turned out to not be the case, obviously. But in that situation where, you for sure count on the offense, you can rely on them. And you mentioned, obviously, Jamar and Joe, and T was really good, and Chase Brown was really good.
Mm-hmm.
Yoshi Voss had a couple nice catches that really kind of helped him out a lot. But when the fumble happens there, you're like, oh, they're gonna take this game over. And they go and score, they tie the game. Joe makes that incredible throw to Jamar in the end zone. It was like 17 yards per the line of scrimmage, but it was probably really like 40 air yards is what it felt like. And so you're like, all right, cool, this is great. And then the defense comes out and gets a couple stops, and you're like, oh, this is awesome. And then the one time I think everyone, the game was on the line, that Joe missed Jamar on that last drive, I just couldn't believe it. And of course, 2 missed field goals, but I was trying to avoid that.
Well, the throw to Jamar for the touchdown was amazing, in part because he just kept backing up. Joe did, because he knew, I'm going to get hit. I just have to get myself some more room. I liked what sports writer Dan Wetzel tweeted out. He said, it's like the inherent DNA of each franchise, Chargers and Bengals, is bubbling up, and thus no one is allowed to win this game.
True.
I mean, that's what it did feel like. And that's where, we always get in the doom and gloom of our Bengal fanhood and whatnot. But there are some other franchises out there, and the Chargers are one of them, that feel as snake bit as we do, if not more so sometimes. The funny thing is, we talked last week about the Herbert versus Burrow, and they showed it last night. Herbert has played in 9 more games, and thus some of those numbers end up looking just better by comparison, in part because he's played just that many more games, half a season plus. But the way Burrow, and at halftime, I was thinking of you in our conversation last night. I was like, well, Herbert kind of claimed this round. But then after halftime, it was the other way around. It was Joe, and Joe is just, I am not going to allow this to happen. And it just becomes too much because there's so many. It's not basketball. One guy cannot take over a game in quite the same way.
Yeah, and I think that when you kind of mentioned that, I mean, those two, Jordan Love, obviously, are making quite the names for themselves for that draft class, which turned out to be pretty wonderful draft class. Big picture, it's aged very well 5 years later. But yeah, I think that for Joe too. Correct me if I'm wrong, Seth. I think as far as teams he's played more than once, the Chargers are the only team he hasn't beat yet.
Yeah, because it's the first game of his career, right?
Yep, and then the next year, they came here. And they put a nice whooping on us, and that was the Super Bowl year. That was kind of the turnaround game, was that in San Francisco back-to-back weeks, if I remember correctly. But once again, it's a team that's just not ready to get started. They come out flat. They don't execute, and we continuously have the same conversation over and over again. It's they can't start a game and they can't close a game. Middle of the game, they're pretty darn good, right? I mean, the middle of the game, they'll compete with anybody. But when it comes down to the first quarter and the fourth quarter, it seems like it's just like they don't know what to do. That feels like the adjustments they just don't make any sense. And I don't know, man.
Are you saying they're the David Bell of football?
I think Zach Taylor's pretty close to him his press conferences, right?
Yeah, I mean, but that idea of starting slowly and ending slowly, that just feels like a Cincinnati Reds season in every game, apparently. It just
facts. Yeah.
No, Zach talked about, we don't need to make sweeping changes and this, that, and the other. There's a writer.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
Well, there's a writer for the Dayton Daily News, and his name is Marcus Hartman, and he's a longtime Ohio State beat guy, and then he moved. I think he originally was from the Dayton area, maybe the Springfield, Xenia type in that area. But I'm not going to call him a curmudgeon, but let's just say, for as quote unquote young as he is, he has some tendencies there about the Grandpa Simpson type stuff. But Marcus has continually said, even when they were good, that Lou Anarumo is not really that good of a defensive coordinator. And if you take it at its value, he's had a good defense 2 of his 6 years here.
Yeah.
And that's just the years he's been here as a defensive coordinator. He's been other places. And obviously he ended up getting fired at those places. So this idea that hey, Lou's going to get them ready. And the national media fell in love with him for those 2 years when it felt like he had things ready. I mean, his Chiefs game plan seemed great, right? Over
every year,
every time they play.
Yeah,
and I like him in a few other ways as well. But it's my wife's a CPA, and for her the numbers are what the numbers are, right? I mean, that's kind of where we are at this point. And if you're not making sweeping, Cam Taylor-Britt, maybe you get credit for developing a guy from Nebraska who was a good, decently high pick, but not necessarily a blue chip,
Right.
sure thing. You developed him pretty quickly into possibly one of the better corners in football, it seemed like. But how do you explain his just losing it basically this year? He ran his mouth early in the season. He had the interception against Kansas City that was really good, a great pick. But basically, since that moment, came to their Brit is basically on the bench almost as much as he's on the field.
Yeah, if you notice when the defense kind of locked in, he was not part of the secondary during the game last night. Which when DJ Turner got hurt, I went, crap.
Well, that takes us to DJ, who Ian Rappaport is reporting, and other people are too, fractured clavicle, likely out.
That was the case, yeah.
So this is just obviously you lost earlier in the season one of your starters, and now you lose another one, and you're going to have to play Cam Taylor-Britt basically the rest of the year.
Hooray for the Bengals fans. Yeah, so I guess, Seth, is this now the time when we start doing mock draft season? Do we start looking at the possibility if the Bengals could get Will Johnson or Ben Morrison, guys like that? Is this what we have to do now?
Well, I know Joe Goodberry, who's a great follow on Twitter. Mm-hmm. Joe Goodberry does really good breakdowns of draft possibilities and things like that, and he scouts pretty well with the tape he reviews and things like that. Yesterday was the first time I think he had, here's what you root for in case you think we're going to make the playoffs, and here's what you root for as far as other games to try to get a better draft pick. You choose your own adventure at this point, and now I think it's been chosen for us.
Yep, sure has. So I wouldn't say corner's primary need, though it's definitely a need. But yeah, it's kind of just, it's almost laughable that the theme of the Zach Taylor regime, and I know everyone's going to talk about, well, they had their most success they've had 2 years in a row under him more than any other coach. And I get that. But I think that was despite him being their head coach, to be honest with you. And I've been very open about that for many of years. But I think now we're at this point where it's like, I don't know if he's coaching for his job. I think on other franchises, he would be coaching for his job. He should be. Really, he should be. You shouldn't lose the games the way you're losing games week in and week out. I mean, that eventually that comes down to coaching execution. And I think now we're at this point where I'm not going to go and say the Super Bowl run was a fluke, because they certainly deserved to get to where they were. But I do really believe that they got there because of their defense. And Joe
the next year they're a play from the Super Bowl too. So it was good both years. But here's one thing I said, even in the Super Bowl run, because let's take us back. Before the Super Bowl run happened, there were folks who didn't think we'd make the playoffs. The Bengals would make the playoffs. There were folks who, even when they made the playoffs, they got to just they get the monkey off their back. They won their one game, but it became just growing. And 2 years in a row, it grew all the way to either the Super Bowl or one step from the Super Bowl. And one thing I always said to defend Zach Taylor, and I'll do it again about last night, X's and O's maybe wasn't the best, right? But the team fought no matter, like in 2020, even after Joe Burrow got hurt, but especially before he got hurt, they weren't winning games.
Right.
The team was fighting. They were playing hard. 2019, once they got rid of Carlos Dunlap, everyone in that room seemed like they were on board with what the plan was. And it might take 2, it might take 3 or 4. It only took a total of 3 years because they go to the Super Bowl in year 3. Last night, they did not give up. It's 27-6. That defense played better for that stretch after that than they have all year long. And you're right, they couldn't sustain it. It's bothersome that in the overtime game, the first game against the Ravens, Henry had the huge run.
Yep.
And then last night, J.K. Dobbins had the huge run as they were trying to figure out if they could force overtime or not and things like that, or maybe a field goal and trying to get back down and kick your own field goal, which that's another thing we should talk about, field goal kicking. But I guess to stay on this topic, I want your thought on that. Yes, X's and O's don't always seem like they're great, but this team, the players, they're millionaires. They could check out anytime they want. And I know I've heard some chirping this year that this is just different because guys aren't as bought in as maybe they were a couple years ago. They look pretty bought into me, despite not having really the talent on defense that you would need.
I think last night was kind of an outlier. I mean, realistically, they've had a lot of these games where you mentioned they can check out any point they want. Seems like they checked out quite a bit after Chase Brown fumbled Thursday night in Baltimore.
Huh?
Seems like they checked out quite a bit in the Derrick Henry run, that game there when they're up big. they just can't seem to keep I wouldn't say keep their focus. I mean, I'm not a football coach. I can't go out there and tell you this, but at some point, X's and O's have to matter, right? That's how the game is played. And yeah, it's great that he's an awesome locker room guy and people like him, but it turns out that he's not very good at managing games. And I think that that's pretty obvious at this point. So I'm at this point with him where I realistically don't know, like, and, it comes back to the who's going to be better for them thing, maybe, but I just don't know, like, how you can keep throwing him back out there and keep losing games the way you are. And part of that is also, look, I mean, guys keep walking out the door and they're not staying. I don't think that's on Zach by any means, but I have to kind of give him the benefit there as well. I don't think he wanted Jesse Bates to leave. I don't think he wanted to see the guys go that have gone, but I do also think that at some point he's got to be held accountable for his record.
I agree with that. I just also think that Marvin Lewis was given like 5.
Yeah, for sure.
5 of his 9 lives were spent as a Bengals head coach. So, the practical side of me says it's not going to happen. Now Lou may not be the defensive coordinator next year. Mm-hmm. That's very likely. I saw a name last night I found interesting, but we also have to remember that it's the Brown family. And if they don't give X amount of control, or if they don't give certain assurances, I saw, Mike Vrabel's name. Certainly, I mean, as far as getting more accountability and things like that, the funny thing is Mike Vrabel plus a Zach Taylor on the offensive side might be kind of nice. But I think that, Mike Vrabel's not going anywhere to be an assistant. His next move, he's going to be a head coach. So you'd have to move on from Zach in order to bring in Vrabel. I don't know. It's just, we're not going to see, I don't think, a head coaching change because Marvin Lewis got so many chances without a Super Bowl appearance.
That's fair. Yeah.
And if Joe Burrow, while it seems like sometimes he's a pretty annoyed, and certainly Jamar Chase's quote about asking Zach, because I don't call the plays. If Joe Burrow ever decided he didn't want to play for Zach Taylor, because that's the other thing. Right. He spoke up for Zach in his rookie year and even the next year before they were Super Bowl, AFC champions, that kind of thing. He didn't have to. There's a difference between kind of towing the company line and going above and beyond to try to speak up for a guy. And I thought Joe Burrow did that there in those first couple of years for Zach Taylor. But if he decided he doesn't want to anymore and he doesn't want to play for him anymore, then that would be about the only thing that I could see necessitating a change.
Yeah. And I'll kind of, I've just kind of spent 5 minutes kind of criticizing him, and I do that a lot. But I'll give him credit where credit was due. I thought he was really good last night. Most of the decisions he made were really good. I mean, how many fourth to goes did they go for last night and they hit them after last week when they couldn't get one going when they really needed to? I thought that his play calling was excellent. I thought that I don't know if necessarily T made that route on his own for that touchdown, or if it was just something that they called this to kind of be a distraction, to kind of be a decoy, and Joe found him, because the route he ran was tremendous. But it seemed like he pushed the right buttons last night, where I think he's really struggled with that quite a bit. Obviously, I'm still very irritated that he doesn't know how to call a red zone offense by any means. Mm-hmm. They seem to leave a lot of points on the table or not have points at all, which, again, we'll get to here in a second. But I digress.
All right. So that point, Evan McPherson, I didn't like someone out there. They were comparing, well, you signed Evan McPherson, but you didn't sign Jamar Chase.
Right. That's stupid.
That's stupid. The money we're talking about and the fact that Jamar is a first-round pick, Jamar is basically tied to Cincinnati until 2028 if they play the game the way they did with T, but even more so because of the fifth-year option, because T was not a first-round pick. And the money we're talking about, even if a kicker signs the highest kicker contract in history, which I don't think he did, it would still pale so much in comparison to what Jamar Chase is asking for and what he's going to get, that the two aren't comparable. But it's just amazing to me. You pay a kicker who is so good. You could game plan off of, well, if we get the ball with a minute left in the first half and we get the ball back in the third quarter, at minimum, we'll get a 52-yard field goal. We'll bang that in, and we'll come back in the second half and maybe turn it into a touchdown or another long field goal. And he can't make anything. He can't make a 50-yarder now at all, a 48-yarder, and he hooked both. The first, well, was it one of the extra points? It looked like the snap went a little inside of the holder, and he had to reach over. And then they had to rush the other one because the play clock was down, and they should have probably taken a timeout. That was the 48-yarder, I think. They rushed it, so the snap came real quick because there was only 1 second on the play clock. But he hooked both of them just left of the crossbar on the left side. It's like he was Money Mac. He was so good for 2-3 years, and now he's just not.
Yeah, and of course I think we all saw that they need to get rid of Evan McPherson stuff. And let's calm down. I mean, let's calm down. Yeah, it hasn't been his best year by any means. But this is really the first year you've had where you can really complain about him. He's missed kicks in the past, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
I know that. But used that 2-year run that we just spent 15 minutes talking about, probably you're not there without him,
right?
And I still think he's very good. Maybe he's just not the next Justin Tucker. You know what? That's okay. That's all right. Yeah, last night was irritating and last night was frustrating, and I'm wondering what has gone wrong this year with him. But I think you'd have a hard time not believing in him still. I mean, kickers miss kicks quite a bit, but what are the Bengals? I mean, this isn't Randy Bullock. This is a guy who has earned his right to be a draft pick as a kicker and has done very well majority of his career. I think he'll bounce back. I think he'll be fine. I'm very irritated he missed 2 kicks last night. I'm irritated to know what's been going on this year. I don't know if it's a Darren Simmons thing. I don't know if it's a new Holder thing, because I think Cal Adamitis is still doing a pretty good job at his job. So I don't know where we're at with it.
Well, the only thing I'll say is it's such a very tenuous situation, because it's all this, my faith in you, I don't have faith in you. Does that affect your confidence when I have to turn to you? They are going for some 4th downs. I think that a year or two ago they would have let him.
I agree. Yeah.
So there is that, but it came down to it last night, and twice they basically sputtered on offense. It was 4th and too long, and they said we need to hit this field goal and take the lead, and 2 times he couldn't deliver. So it's going to be tough. It's just kind of like, well, there's a whole basket full of problems here, and that's another one to throw in there. I guess as we close out here, and we won't even get into it, they're going into bye and everything like that. Recharge the batteries, things like that. Obviously, there's still a chance you could be that 7th seed, I suppose, if they really, really turned up the Jets a little bit there and took off, but that's not likely at this point.
Right.
I want to talk to you a little bit about Zach Taylor's wife had a post a week or so ago about, and it was actually her. It wasn't so much her sons or kids they weren't the ones that were worried. They're basically like, oh, toughen up, mom, whatever. But she was sad that her kids would have to answer the questions and go to school and hear it from kids who's probably, those kids are hearing it from their dads, and so on and so forth. And I don't want to even like question whether she has a right to feel that way. And it's certainly terrible, 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 terrible if people are picking on Zach Taylor's kids. So there's that. But I live in Columbus, Ohio, where it's equidistant. Cleveland, even Pittsburgh, Cincinnati. And then you get the bandwagon Chiefs fans. And there's a kid whose family's from Buffalo, so he's a Bills fan.
Lucky him.
For now.
Yeah.
Not in the playoffs. But
right.
I'm serious. Going back to even the Super Bowl, the AFC Championship the following year, even some regular season games that second year after they went to the Super Bowl, my son can't go to school the day after a loss without being mercilessly picked on. It's ridiculous.
It's silly.
And he goes to bed at night after one of these primetime games, dreading going to school the next day, because these kids are picking on. Now, maybe he needs to get a thicker skin and realize it's a game and not take it so seriously. And maybe that's my fault as his dad. But this is just crazy. When you're not, like, I would presume most kids in the Cincinnati area are Bengals fans, right? So you don't have to worry about that as much. We're all going to be sad when we get to school. But this is crazy. These, up here in Columbus, it's definitely more Browns. The Browns fans keep their mouths shut for the most part, obviously.
Yeah, for obvious reasons.
I mean, some 13-year-old telling your kid that the Bengals stink when he's a Browns fan, get out of here with that, right? But
yeah, I'm
just amazed that this kind of stuff happens regardless of if Zach Taylor's kids or not. And I just wanted to put that out there. And my heart hurts a little bit whenever they lose more. And it's not, you said, there was a time I remember when Ohio State lost to Clemson following the 2019 season, and Clemson went on to lose to LSU. That's kind of when it flipped for me. I know you're not your child isn't as old as mine are, I went from being angry as a fan that my team lost to looking over and seeing my little kid crying and knowing I don't have any time whatsoever to be angry about my team losing. I've got to be
Yeah.
there for him. And it is an interesting thing. I don't get nearly as angry. I probably didn't get nearly as angry once I had kids as I did before I had kids at my sports teams. But it is interesting how that evolves.
I have noticed that myself, where my emotions don't run super high anymore during games. And that's not just for the Bengals, that's just in general. I mean,
Yeah.
like, realistically, I'll be honest with you. I love Notre Dame football. I haven't watched the last 2 games.
Hmm.
I just kind of went and did my own thing, spent time with my family, checked my phone, saw if they won or not. They did. Great. Awesome. Move on. And that's not to say like I mean, that's not to say like what I don't care, because I certainly do, but more important things in life, man. For Zach Taylor's wife, like, yes, I just criticized him quite a bit. I'm not his biggest supporter, but his wife shouldn't have to feel the effects of that from other people. His kids
Hmm.
shouldn't have to deal with that. That's not
I agree.
fair. Um, for us, this is our escape for a couple hours on a Sunday, right? This is just kind of watch something on TV, spend time with our families, eat some good food, drink some sodas, whatever. The people who just like let this affect their day-to-day life, like, find a new hobby. I mean, for sure. Like, like you said, you live in Columbus, and I know Ohio State football there is, it's very rare you'll find someone who's up there who does not root for Ohio State football. And they had the game that lost to Oregon. All my Ohio State friends said after that game, they went, yeah, that sucks, but Oregon's really good. And that's fine. It doesn't have to be like you throw things, you break things in your house, you set things on fire, then you go socially criticize people. Like, I'm very open about my frustrations and criticisms of my sports teams, but I'm not like attacking them. I'm just
You don't
like,
go to a personal level. And
no,
anybody who's
nor
doing
should you.
and if it's like a 10 or 11-year-old, I'm not happy about that 10 or 11-year-old's actions. But like I said earlier, it's probably coming from a parent who is making it
For sure.
personal. And let's face it, those parents of those kids who go to school with the Taylor kids know that Zach Taylor's kids in the class. So
Yeah.
that's where I could throw a hat across the room or something like that when Joe Burrow gets sacked for the 7th time.
Right.
But I need to tell Johnny on his way to school the next day, hey, we're upset about the Bengals losing, but it's not little Zach Taylor's kid's fault. Like teach the kids to understand the difference. And sometimes grown-ups don't understand the difference either.
I think here too, it's just kind of, Cincinnati fans, the fan bases just have this major chip on their shoulders. It's one of the reasons I hate UC sports so much. It's just this thing where they act like it's like them against the world. It's like, no one just cares about you. No one cares. But this is the same fan base that also dumped garbage all over Carson Palmer's yard because he had a bad game. And it's like, guys, get a life. I mean,
And
yeah,
they also booed Andy Dalton at the All-Star game softball.
yeah. And then he had the best year of his career the next year.
He's healthy, he probably wins MVP. So
Right.
yeah, okay, guys, come on. I'm not going to go into the UC talk because as an Ohio State fan, I have my opinions, obviously. But at the same time, I think you're right. And certainly the funny thing for me, though, is Ohio State is like my Yankees, right? So I know how to live up here where the expectations are always here. And I know how to be a Reds and Bengals fan. So, okay. That's just funny to me sometimes the way I cope with my different. I have to remember, this is the team that never should lose.
Right. Yeah.
But, all right, Tim, thanks so much. You've helped me cope with the situation last
Likewise.
night. I appreciate that. And with the bye week, we likely won't be back next week, but we will continue to bring these shows to you. Like and review us and tell your friends about Welcome to the Jungle. Thanks so much, Tim. I appreciate you, bud.
Thanks, Seth.